Welcome, everybody. This is not official starting of our meeting. Just to explain why yet we have not started, we have some technical problems to prepare some PowerPoint. No, it's fine. Okay, I should have announced it earlier. So technical problems obviously have been solved. So I'm very happy to have the possibility, colleagues, speakers, and other guests to our today's hearing on refugee sponsorship. You might know that according to an UNHCR report on projected resettlement needs for 2017, it's estimated that around about 1.9 million refugees globally will be in need of resettlement. For some people, 1.9 million sounds a big number. We have learned just before this meeting that there are more refugees only in Lebanon, and I can tell you, coming from Germany, that in 2015 only Germany took nearly 1 million refugees, so the half of that number that should be resettled. So I think this clearly is something together we all can deal with. Nevertheless, to meet all the different challenges related to asylum and migration, we do need, just to make it very clear, a kind of an holistic approach. So different measures are needed as well inside European Union, but also outside European Union and in maybe new kinds of partnerships with countries of origin, with countries on the African and Arabian continents. Having said this, one of the measures, and it's clearly only one of the measures we might talk about, is the question of safe and legal pathways, amongst others, to reach the European Union. And in addition to all the responsibilities that are on our national governments and on public authorities, we have to check the possibility of the instrument of refugee sponsorship, so to include private people in this task. We have seen that to some extent such a model has been successfully used in Canada, so to find out to what extent it can also be helpful in European Union is only a very good reason. I can tell you that regarding our negotiations on a reform to the Dublin system, our Dublin shadow rapporteur, Elly Schlein, who later on will lead this exchange, did a very good fight to introduce this system into the Dublin reform. And now we provide, in our proposal, for the possibility to allow certain organizations to become a sponsor of an applicant. And of course, we have to make sure that this responsibility, this private responsibility for a refugee, does not take lifelong, but at least only for the time until the final decision about the asylum request is taken. So today we will have a first panel to talk about sponsorship and how this can help in relocation and resettlement, and Elly will lead this panel. Then we will have later on a second panel moderated by our Vice President Joe Weidenholzer on the advantages for the social and economic integration of beneficiaries of sponsorship, and maybe more general of integrating them nevertheless by what means ever. I very much hope that the outcome of this hearing will deliver us some more insights to understand the model of sponsorship and how to help displaced people and how to better deal with the overall situation. And I'm very much convinced that the outcome will be very useful for our socialist exploration for further steps in the holistic approach on refugees, on migration. So I'm very happy to see so many people now in this room. I hope we will have a fruitful debate. And having said this, I will directly give the floor to my colleague, Dublin Shadow Rapporteur Ellie Schlein from Italy, who will moderate now the very first panel. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Birgit, and thanks to you all for being here for this very interesting discussion today. Just before introducing our guest for the first discussion, let me stress out the satisfaction for what Birgit already mentioned. We managed, I was the shadow rapporteur for the S&D group in the negotiation on the Dublin regulation. And we strongly wanted to put the possibility for a sponsorship in the framework of the new Dublin regulation, because we really think that it's a way to try to incentivize relocation. And this does not have to, of course, reduce the number of resettlements. But still, we, in the process of the negotiation on Dublin, we strongly refused the sanctionatory approach proposed by the European Commission in the Dublin regulation reform. And we thought it would be much more effective to have an approach based on incentives to comply and disincentives to stay out of the system. And this not only for asylum seekers, but also for member states. So we thought, even if we stated in that very strong and ambitious reform voted with a huge majority a couple of weeks ago, that there is no first country of entry principle anymore, and it was replaced with a permanent and automatic mechanism of relocation based on fair quotas for each and every member state of the European Union. And all member states have to participate to this new system. Otherwise, there would be consequences also on the structural funds. That was the idea. But the main point is how to incentivize. What can be the interest for a member state to go through a sponsorship program? Well, once we have put on paper the principle according to which every member state should do its own part, and let me remind you, we are not inventing anything, because this is the principle already enshrined in the treaties in Articles 78 and 80, when they talk about solidarity and equal sharing of responsibility. So we're not inventing anything. But since we are inserting the system in the new Dublin regulation reform, at least in the position of the Parliament that should then be negotiated with the Council, we wanted to say, well, if every member state has to do its part, then it's better for everyone to start welcoming people that have some kind of link, meaningful link with that country. It could be a family link. It could be another kind of meaningful link, a previous stay, a diploma or qualification. But it could also mean any kind of other link. And in the, let's say, in this context, here you have the possibility for a sponsorship that we have inserted. It says that member states may provide that organizations that have been approved by the member state in accordance with specific requirements to be set out in national law, have the possibility to become the sponsor of an applicant for international protection who has lodged an application in the EU. And the organization sponsoring an applicant should provide for his or her transfer and his or her stay in the member state where the sponsor is established until a final decision on his or her application has come. So we wanted to give a strong signal here, but nevertheless we thought, and that's why the group wanted to organize this discussion of today, to look around and to see what kind of models of sponsorship are around. There are different models, we know. We were going to hear some from Lebanon, from Canada, from Italy, and we know that in Italy, and I welcome other guests for the later discussion, in Italy it's a long story, because I was just looking at the old law of 1998. Long before these more restrictive, let's say, migration policies of the member states, the Turco-Napolitano law in Italy was already foreseen, not for the case of asylum seeker, but in general. In the case of migrants, it would say that there was the possibility for regions, for municipalities, for professional associations or trade unions, for organization and NGOs, civil society organization that were working for at least 3 years in migration, there was this possibility to sponsor an applicant. Then, unfortunately, this, I think, went out of the Testo Unico dell'Immigrazione, is the name of the migration law in Italy, but the idea was already there. I think we can look back there and learn something, learn a lesson from these models that we will be confronting today for the future and for having a more human, a more effective and forward-looking migration policy. So, without further ado, let me just give the floor to the first of our speakers today. And I thank a lot my colleague and our group vice president, Tania Fajon, for welcoming this guest for us. We have 3 guests from Lebanon. We have here with us Professor Kavtarani. I hope the pronunciation is good. He is the Dean of the School of Education at Lebanese International University. We often make the example of Lebanon when we try to analyze the numbers of the phenomenon. It's clear to everybody that this is not an invasion. I mean, we are talking about, in 2016, something like 1,300,000 asylum requests in the whole European Union. It can seem something, it can seem a lot, or it can seem not so much. It depends. If you put it in a context, we're a continent of 500 million people. It means that we're talking about the 0.25 of the European population. I cannot believe that 28 of the most powerful governments in the world cannot effectively deal with 0.25 with the European population. And it's fairly the same number of refugees that Lebanon is hosting alone. But Lebanon is a country of 4 million inhabitants and not 500. So thanks a lot for being here. And please give us your testimony about what's the situation in your country and what is the future, according to you, in the migration policies. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Tania, for giving me a second chance. I'm a visual learner. I never learn by hearing. I learn through seeing. And if the IT can just give us one slide to see my country's visual of one slide, just one slide.
It's coming.
It's coming. That slide will tell you exactly what your approach is. Not this one, the one I was just... Yes, the Lebanese University. True.
How can you see so far? I cannot see anything.
Yeah, that. No. It's. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic.
That's okay.
We have it.
2 slides only. 2 slides. One more time, thank you. I just wanted to see, for those who just joined us, exactly, if we want to talk about model of sponsorship. This is my country, back in 2011 and 10. To your right, you can see Syria. I just want you to take 2 minutes or 1 minute to look into this particular image. 11, 12, 13, and 14. This in itself explains the image we're talking about. We are a nation of 4 million. Now, it's the other way around. We are becoming the minorities, the Lebanese. It's not an offense. It's not that we don't want the Syrians. We do. We accept them. But this is a nation that has accepted 50% of its population. How did we work about with the models of sponsorship? How did we do that? The notion was to accept everybody. Yes. This is the first picture I wanted you to see. The second picture that I would love you to see is the 3 words that we usually forget to do. This is 3 statements that we need to all combine and see these 3 words. segregation, integration, and inclusion. Look at the diagrams, and probably you'll know this without any explanation. You segregate, you live on different borders. You integrate, you get in someone to join you at your own rules and regulations. Will that succeed? Which model will succeed? Or which model will help such people integrate into a community? Will they succeed? Inclusion is to set up rules and regulations that foster heterogeneous thinking. That means we look at the strength of individual. We try to empower people so that they are included into the society. Which model fits the one we're talking about? To do that, I go back to one slide, and that's it. And to tell you what we did, this is a slide I always love to work with. You want incentives, or you don't have incentives, you get resistance. So you have to be very careful. You meet today, you meet tomorrow, you meet next tomorrow. That's your plan. No action plan, you have a treadmill. Now, what I want us to tell you, our humble experience with this number of people, the model that we took was two models: municipalities and education. The municipalities are being sponsored through certain NGOs, or sometimes the municipality itself tries to sponsor itself by empowering immigrants and taking care of them to do probably work within the area of that vicinity. In Lebanon, I call them villages because of a square meter. I'll give an example of 5,000 inhabitants of a small village with 27,000 Syrians opposite the Lebanese. But the setup was the municipality took care of that by making sure that those people would have daily work through the municipality, or those people will be included into certain projects within the municipality. The other project, which is the education system, is, and it came from the theory, I don't want to be too technical, there's no other way that a student learns unless from a student. There's no other way that an immigrant or displaced person can learn only from the displaced, not from the home country. So we decided to develop academy, call it division of teachers, of Syrian teachers, empower them. They go down into the community of the Syrians where they're included to teach and to have this cohesion of Syrians and Lebanese. So these two models that at this moment is working perfectly. To talk about crime, we cannot generalize. It's 1%, 2%. But that image that I just showed you, the number of immigrants or displaced Syrians in our country, I don't think Europe has this particular number to call if we compare. Try to remember 1938 at Evian. What happened, for those who remember history? Try to remember 1951, the protocol. And today, many politicians tearing up the protocol of refugees. Let's learn from not mistakes, but let's not have those mistakes echo into today's world. Sponsorship is one means. It's the inclusion of a society into the community that has to be well protracted within a parameter. We're a small nation, but I totally understand. If you empathize, you definitely will have your success stories. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, really, Mr. Kaftarani, for the fantastic contribution and for stressing out the need to what we have to do just afterwards. I mean, the second phase, integration, social inclusion. In Italy, for example, we have an experience which, after 30 years, we still are not recognizing ourselves as an immigration country. And so migrants are welcomed in a system that is for 80% an emergency system, and only for 20% is the so-called SPRAR network, which involves the local municipalities and communities, as you were mentioning, which is, I think is crucial to ensure also the capacity to better have a social inclusion in the receiving society. So just let me introduce you briefly and welcome warmly our second guest of today, Mary Coulter. She is immigration and asylum policies counselor for the mission of Canada to the EU. We were just saying that Canada is another very good example. We often use the numbers to show what is the problem of the European Union. It is not a problem of means. It is not a problem of resources. It is a problem of lack of political will. And you can see that by the fact that in 2015, the European governments had committed to do 160,000 relocation from Italy and Greece and 22,000 resettlements. And they should have done this in 2 years, but in 2 years, they've done only slightly more than 30,000 on 160,000 they committed to do. And in 4 months, I think in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, Canada managed to resettle alone with an ocean in between 40,000 people. And then even more, you're gonna, but you see the point. It's incredible that the 28 European governments could not even show that same number of solidarity in welcoming refugees from their partner countries, whereas Canada has managed to resettle more than that number in only 4 months. So it tells you a lot on the fact that the European problem, according to me, is a problem of lack of political will within the European Council, especially by some of the governments. So Mary was also a career diplomat. She has worked at the national headquarters of citizenship and immigration in Canada, and she also served in many embassies. I see in Moscow, for example, in Hong Kong. So thanks a lot for being here and for sharing with us the good practice of the Canadian sponsorship program.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and thank you to the S&D team for inviting me here today. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share our experience. Of course, it's Canada's experience. I'm not sitting in your chairs, but I'm a true believer in exchanging best practices. I know that I've learned a lot since I've been here, since August, as Canada's representative to the European Union on migration issues. You'll see if you picked up the slide package that I sent, it's 35 slides. I don't nearly have time for 35 slides, but I hope you'll take it away with you. There's some information there as well as on our website, and by all means, you can reach out to me. I'd be delighted to answer any questions. So I'm going to move quite quickly through the slides, and so we'll see how it goes. I also brought a short film to show you if time allows, but we'll see how we do with the time. So I just want to start with an overview of our resettlement programs, and then I'm going to talk specifically about our privately sponsored refugees. So we do also have government-assisted refugees, and then we have some blended or hybrid programs. I'm also going to talk about the challenges that we face. And how we mitigate those challenges in what we would call integration. So we talk about settlement and integration, and in our vocabulary we say, oh, we don't assimilate, we integrate. And you say you don't integrate, we include. So what I've learned also is we need to get on the same page when I'm talking to others about the terminology that we use. I also want to talk about additionality, and it was mentioned earlier. Privately sponsored refugees are seen as a program that allows us to do more than we could otherwise. So it's not about civil society or community stepping into government's role. It's about those actors allowing us to accept more refugees. And you made reference to this, but this was very much the case in the recent initiative that we took on regarding Syrian refugees. And I'll show you some numbers along those lines, but I think it's a very important concept. All right, so I'll flip through here. So as I mentioned, we have 3 programs: government-assisted, private-sponsored refugees, and then blended visa office referrals, which is a bit of a hybrid. Looking here at our levels, so we go all the way back to 1980, all the way to present, and you see the peaks and valleys. The red line represents our privately sponsored refugee program. So you can almost see what was happening in the world as you see those spikes, or certainly Canada's response to those events. We've resettled 291,000 refugees through the private sponsorship program since 1979. So it gives you a sense of the size of the program. 291,000. So you can see in this chart that over time, especially for the privately sponsored refugees, and specifically in 2015, there's been quite an increase, and that really came out from an outpouring from the Canadian civil society, from community groups in terms of privately sponsored refugees, and I'll explain more about that. For government-assisted, there's also been an increase, and certainly you spoke to this, but in 2016, we saw those numbers shoot up to nearly 24,000 in that particular year. Overall, of course, we're in the 40s. And then blended is something relatively new where we've approached in somewhat of a hybrid manner. So just a little bit on the government-assisted refugees. These individuals are the most vulnerable. So the focus of our government-assisted refugee program is really to identify those individuals who are the most in need, where we can provide very specific services, often outside the capacity of community groups. So we have to step in. It could be victims of torture. It could be those individuals who have, single women with children. There's all sorts of programs, and I could speak more about that because within that program we have specific programs to help some individuals. All right, so multi-year commitments. So we talk a lot about the Syrian refugees, and certainly they're in need, and it's at the front of our minds right now. But I wanted to point out that we do have commitments to other populations, multi-year commitments. So you see here Iraqis, Bhutanese, and so forth. Gars, so people ask me this question, what are your top source country for government-assisted refugees? And we'll compare this to the privately sponsored refugees. Syria, 2015, right at the top, but then you can see that there's a number of different populations that we've accepted through our government-assisted refugee sponsorship program. Blended, we don't have a lot of time. Again, I'm happy to take questions, but we have a couple of different hybrid approaches where the government and the sponsor, for example, both provide for 6 months of income support, and then the sponsor will provide an additional 1 year of emotional and social support, and that would be for very specific cases. So, it's not just one population we're talking about a lot of people within that population who have very different challenges, and we have to approach them in different ways and be, I think, quite strategic and inclusive in how we develop these programs. All right, so this is really where I want to sort of dive in terms of the private sponsorship. So, as I mentioned, 291,000 since 79. More than 10,000 refugees have arrived to sponsor groups in more than 300 Canadian cities. And this was even in that first sort of year of the program. In addition, the number of Syrians have been resettled through and just to go back to this question of additionality. So this is an addition, again, I'll keep stressing this, to the government-assisted refugees. So we can go through that. These are the top source countries for privately sponsored refugees. Again, Syria is the top for 15 and 16, but then you can see very quickly, and we talk often about the fact that there's a significant number of refugees who then sponsor other individuals or are part of organizations that sponsor other individuals, and that those are reflected in the numbers you see that are different for the privately sponsored than the government sponsored, because you have this motivating factor of those individuals who have come in. And of course it also speaks when you see Syrian to the need and to the response for the need. Privately sponsored refugees, so they're referred by private sponsors in Canada. So these can be many different types of organizations. They can be faith-based, ethnic, humanitarian, and normally outside of these special programs, they would receive support, income and settlement support from the sponsor for 1 year. So private sponsorship does a lot of things, and I'll get into that more, but it's really about building welcoming communities. If you have people involved in something and dedicated and working with their neighbors, we've seen really impactful outcomes for those communities. It also creates strong networks for the refugees, And it helps maintain public support. So this is, we often get into the sort of the weeds on this, and we don't talk about this part of it. But, you know, we had our last government run on a platform of bringing people in, and people were very supportive of it. And I think a lot of that comes from that history of having people very personally involved in welcoming and supporting refugees. So who can be sponsored? And you would know well the definition of a sponsor, but it's also for people who have been seriously and personally affected by civil war or armed conflict or suffered mass violation of human rights. So they do have to be outside their country of origin, they have to be outside of Canada, and they have no other durable solution. So we're not talking here about our asylum process, and we were talking a little bit about this with other panelists. I think that's for another day and another presentation, but these are individuals that are outside of Canada and outside their country of origin. Okay. So let's go into a little bit of detail here. I'm going to read, which I don't want to do, but I think that it's worth taking the time. So the refugees are identified by the sponsoring groups themselves, and it's usually through a family or a community connection. They're assessed by a Canadian visa officer, and this is a Canadian visa officer abroad. So part of our foreign office or our foreign service are specially trained to act as independent tribunals, and they make those decisions abroad. And they have to meet the definition of a refugee as defined in our legislation. The Canadian government covers all the administrative costs. Sponsors cover the immediate settlement costs, and the refugees get a loan for their travel costs. So this is something that's, I think, a little bit different, and they pay that back over time as they're able, and again, we can get into that. The Canadian government, so upon arrival in Canada, the refugees receive permanent resident status right away. They are a permanent resident from the time that they land, and then they have a pathway to citizenship. Refugees, like newcomers, can immediately access government-funded settlement services. So we do have special services for refugees, but then we have a very large settlement and integration program for all migrants, and they would have access to this right away. So official language training, employment readiness are examples. Okay, so what do the sponsors have to provide? Okay. So the federal government works hand in hand with partners such as private sponsors, provinces, territories, municipalities, all level of governments to make this system work. And they assure that the refugees have a support system in place and that support system is aware of how to access those services. So private sponsors play a really important role. They welcome the newcomers at the airport. They provide the cost of food, rent, household utilities, day-to-day living. They provide clothing, furniture, household goods. They locate interpreters. They select a family physician, a dentist. They assist in applying for provincial health care coverage and extra coverage that we provide specifically for refugees until they're eligible for provincial coverage. Enroll children in the school, the adults in language training. They introduce newcomers to community networks. They provide orientation around banking services, transportation. They help in the search of employment. So it's a big task. It's not just showing up at the airport and raising some funds. They're very much involved in the day-to-day life of these individuals. I won't go through this in too much detail, but I just did want to give you an example of one group, a refugee sponsorship group, and it's the World University Service of Canada, and they've been sponsoring refugees since 1978, and they're focused on sponsoring refugees who are student age. And they really, not only do they give the experience to young Canadians of doing this, but then they help to integrate those students into their university, help to get their studies up and going again. And I think it's very effective because it's sort of a peer-to-peer type of sponsorship. Okay. Whoops. Here I want to talk about the challenges. There are huge challenges. There are huge joys, but there are also huge challenges. So for all refugees, a lot of obstacles to face around language skills, often low language skills. In many cases, there's limited formal education, not all, of course. Difficulty in assessing affordable housing, range of health issues as a result of their experiences. Limited work experience, certainly no Canadian experience, often no experience in other countries. So real struggles here. I mean, I think we do see for all refugees that the outcomes improve over time, and that largely it's a welcoming society, and that integration outcomes, social integration outcomes are strong, but the other outcomes are we continue to look for ways to improve. But I'm going to take some time now and look at the privately sponsored versus the government sponsored, and you'll see that there is certainly a difference there. So I'll skip over this, just talks a little bit about the services that are available to them. Benefits of private sponsorship, I talked about the welcoming communities and public and political support, supports family reunification, and also it relieves pressure on the UNHCR to identify cases for resettlement if we're able to take some of those. Okay, so I'm jumping. Benefits of the private sponsorship program. So we talk about some of the good outcomes with private sponsorship. They gain a foothold in the labor market. They get dedicated, personalized support, and stronger settlement outcomes overall. They perform better economically, at least over the first 3 years of settlement, with a higher incidence of employment, higher income, lower assistance on social assistance, and they're more likely to develop social networks in Canada. So I think that's the real point that I wanted to get to with this. Maybe one or two more things, and then I will wrap it up. High quality sponsorship applications. So this is very important. The government really invests in these sponsorship groups. So they give them sponsorship training program. There's a lot to learn if you want to sponsor someone. And the groups of 5, we have sponsorship agreement holders, which are larger organizations that have a lot of experience, and they can identify individuals without them having gone through UNHCR as a referral, for example. But for a group of 5, we require that. And that's something that we've learned over time in developing these programs. Communication from the government is also very important, and we keep very close contact with those groups. So there we go. We'll go to the question page, and I'll wrap it up. But thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Mary, and I just wanted to leave some room for questions, because I'm sure that there's going to be, and I have many for you, so I'm just kidding. Let me go quickly to the next speaker, which is, and welcome her as well, Donatella Candura. She is Vice Prefect in the International Relations Unit of the Department for Civil Liberties and Immigration of the Italian Ministry of Interior. She has a degree in law. She is a civil servant with the title of Vice Prefect. She has many experiences in the public administration, and since 2005, she has been working for the Italian Ministry of Interior. She started with, if I'm not mistaken, with the Department of Firefighters, Public Rescue and Civil Defense, and then moved to the Department for Civil Liberties and Immigration. And in particular, she is responsible for the Italian resettlement program. So thanks for being here and for sharing the experience of the Italian government on this very important matter.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and sorry for my voice. I hope you can hear me. Okay. If translation is provided, I will speak in Italian. The presentation is in English, but I will speak Italian. Okay. Oggi vorrei.
I'd like to give you a general overview of the Italian model of refugee sponsorship. First and foremost, currently in Italy there are 2 pathways to Italy for asylum for people requiring international protection. That is resettlement, which is a government program managed and coordinated by the Home Office together with other partners and actors. And then we have a private sponsorship program, and we've called it the Humanitarian Corridors Project. Both of these programs were launched in 2015, Therefore, they are both recent and they've been developed in parallel and also in synergy, because the procedures are very similar, and therefore we have managed to make them complementary. Now, with regard to the private sponsorship program, the first protocol or the first project was signed, the protocol was signed in December 2015, and it was signed on the one hand by, well, private sponsorship represents a public-private cooperation. So on the one hand, we have the Sant'Egidio community, the Evangelic Churches Federation, and the Waldensian Church, and they are the private associations. And then on the other hand, we've got the Italian Ministry of the Interior and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this first memorandum of understanding, which was signed in December 2015, as a result of it, 1,000 people have come to Italy, and they are mainly Syrians who came from Lebanon. And then we signed a second memorandum of understanding for humanitarian corridors. And once again, the signatories are the community of Sant'Egidio. And then at the Italian Bishops' Conference involving Caritas and the Migrantes Foundation. And thanks to that MOU signed in January this year, 500 people in need of international protection are going to be coming from Ethiopia. And the first group of 25 people from Eritrea, South Sudan, and Somalia have recently arrived. They came on the 30th of November. Given the excellent partnership, we signed a third MOU, which is basically the continuation of the first project. And the signatories are again the community of Sant'Egidio, the Evangelic Churches Federation, and the Waldensian Church, together with the Italian Ministry of the Interior and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That MOU was recently signed in November this year, and it allows for the transfer of 1,000 people in need of international protection over the coming 2 years from Lebanon and also from Morocco. I'd just like to stop and focus on a couple of aspects, particularly selection criteria. I'd like to say that selection is carried out by the private associations, which put forward a list of beneficiaries, but then it's carried out on the basis of shared criteria, and they are set out in the MOUs. There are two main criteria. These are people who have already been recognized as refugees, at least prima facie, by the UNHCR. And there are also people who have vulnerable situations linked to age or health or personal issues. In addition, a number of other criteria can also be taken into account. For example, people who might have some kind of support already in Italy, and people who have some kind of link, a family link or a social link to Italy. With regard to the procedure, on the basis of the aforementioned criteria, the private associations making the proposals through people who are on site, they put forward a list of people who can benefit from the program together with the UNHCR. And each actor, each signatory has its own role to play in this procedure. So the list of beneficiaries is validated by the Ministry of the Interior, and that has to do with security checks. I don't want to talk too much about this, but I think that we've set up a security procedure that perhaps other states don't have. That has to do with the humanitarian corridors program and our settlement program, because our embassies take digital fingerprints of the people who are to be transferred to Italy. Those fingerprints are sent to our police force, and then all of the necessary checks are carried out on national and international databases. And then the people come to the airport, their fingerprints are taken again to make certain that we have the right identity of the people coming into our country. After that, if the security checks go well, the Italian embassy issues a visa to these people so that they can come into the country. And then everything that has to do with travel, accommodation, reception, and all of the other services provided in Italy, integration measures, socio-cultural integration, job training, language training, all of that is guaranteed by the sponsors, by the private bodies. Now, I'd just like to talk about two aspects in particular. As I said previously, our embassy issues visas. That is the key that allows for entrance into our country. So the limited territorial validity visa is given to these people, enabling them to come safely to Italy, and they don't have to travel by sea or undertake any kind of dangerous trip. Then these people come to Italy, and they are known as asylum seekers. So basically, when they get to the airport, they make an application for asylum, and they follow the normal asylum application procedure. Then they are interviewed by the territorial commissions for the recognition of international protection. And in 99% of the cases, they are granted refugee status. And this takes place after the interview. I should point out, and this is another aspect, that the synergy and the coordination among different actors and partners, because the program provides for the establishment of a group made up of different bodies and administrations and authorities. They all take part in the program, as well as the stakeholders. There are the Ministry for Health, for example, I haven't mentioned them, and the UNHCR, the National Asylum Commission. And there are regular meetings among all of these partners in order to be able to analyze together any possible problems and come up with solutions for them. And prior to every arrival, there's a real coordination activity together with the police forces as well to make sure that everything goes as well as possible and that the people are received in as best a fashion as possible. And then the associations that create databases and reports containing the data and the results achieved. Now, the goals that we think we can achieve through the sponsorship program. First and foremost, we want to avoid deaths at sea. Therefore, we want to avoid people needing international protection undertaking dangerous trips by boat in the Mediterranean Sea. We also want to prevent exploitation of these people by traffickers, networks, and criminals. And then we want to increase and expand legal pathways into Italy because, as I said previously, we've set up a government settlement program, but the fact that there's a private sponsorship program has enabled us to double the number of people arriving in our country safely. What about the added value of this private sponsorship program? Well, there's a more direct relationship between the sponsors and the beneficiaries. There's a a relationship of trust, a more human relationship, if you like. And then there's an increase in solidarity in our society, and also a more integrated whole of society approach to the whole issue of protection and integration of refugees. And this approach involves all of society, a broader slice of social actors, if you like. I'd just like to point out a number of differences related to our program. Here you can see the figures from our resettlement program. The first phase, 1,989 refugees were to be resettled under the Council conclusions on the 20th of July 2015. The second phase, after October 2019, there should be 1,000 refugees coming in. I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are differences between private sponsorship and the government resettlement program involves selection carried out by our office. There's a unit which is called the resettlement unit that carries out selection on the basis of UNHCR dossiers. And then there's the pre-departure activity to organize travel, and that takes place with the IOM. And then for reception, accommodation and integration, that is the responsibility of the System for the Protection of Asylum Seekers and Refugees. Now, unlike the private sponsorship program, people coming in are directly recognized as refugees. They don't have to go via the Territorial Commission for Recognition of International Protection. Why? Because this is people who have had recognized status by the UNHCR. They have already been examined by that body, and therefore there is recognition, and these people don't have to go through the interview procedure. I'll stop there. I do hope everything is clear. Very clear. Thank you very much.
So we are already late, unfortunately, but we started slightly late. So just to collect some of your questions, if there are any, and let me also welcome the other two guests from Lebanon, Mohamed Al-Masri and Brian Lally. Where are they? Oh, yes, they're there. Welcome. And let me also welcome some of my colleagues, Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, who is also the responsible for the very delicate discussion on visas. We just were talking about visas, and he is particularly focused on the fight of the S&D group on humanitarian visas, and also the colleagues Peter Niedermüller and Joseph Weidenholzer that later will let's say, be the moderator for the next panel. So thanks for being here. Juan Fernando, the floor is yours.
Precisely. I'll make it short, just to thank you, Donatella. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Sant'Egidio, for the work that has been carried out so far, for the work ahead. And thank you for making the point of legal pathways, easing legal pathways, making them possible. There's been a talk about humanitarian corridors, most important. There is much to be done to follow the Canadian pattern of private sponsorship, cooperating with public authorities, but it doesn't mean that the European law does not have to play its role to its very best, which means that it's got to move ahead, it's got to be changed so that it may have a contribution to create legal pathways that for the time being do not exist and are not implemented to its full potential. One of them being, of course, humanitarian visas. I just wanted to let you know, Sant'Egidio, that we appreciate your strong vocal stance on the matter. We encourage you to be vocal precisely because it's a goal yet to be achieved, which has encountered resistance in its worst expression imaginable from the Council as the missing link of the decision-making process of the European Union. We got a problem here. The Council does not want humanitarian visas ever. And we gotta change this situation. We gotta bring about change, overcoming difficulties, and creating some legal avenue for humanitarian visas to contribute to the difference that is yet to be made. I just wanted to let you know that here in the European Parliament, there are many of us, of course, including all of us present here, S&D members, many of us who have been striving hard, fighting, up for a fight worth fighting, which is precisely this, creating legal pathways, because if they are not, of course, all the human beings will be abandoned to despair, risking their lives, and so many times losing their lives, while trying to achieve the goal, which is one way or the other, make it here. So I appreciated much all this discussion, but I want you to know that we appreciate also all the background of your commitment, of your work, of your devotion to create a new situation which is to be brought about, and we still have a goal to be accomplished, which is getting this file, the visa code, completed over the mandate of the European Parliament, and one way or the other, getting the Commission to fully commit itself to bring about change through the Council, so that humanitarian visas may also be a part of this puzzle of new solutions for a situation which is untenable. Thank you.
Okay, so since we are late, I will just ask a couple of questions to our speakers, and I give the floor to Joseph for our next panel. So one question to Mary would be, you made a very good point by specifying that the idea is not that organization, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, or sponsors in general, private sponsors, should not replace the state from the state responsibility, of course. There was a discussion that we already had in the negotiation on Dublin. The idea for us is more that, as I said, not to replace the responsibility, but to be an additional incentive, because it's true that civil society organization, like we have the guest of the next panel from Comunità Sant'Egidio and Federazione delle Chiese Evangeliche, it's a good example of what kind of contribution, very positive contribution they can bring to the social inclusion of the asylum seekers in the country where they are supported. But of course, in our idea that we inserted in the Dublin regulation reform, the access to health services and any kind of other services to be provided would still be up to the national government, and it would be just a matter of granting the transfer and the accommodation. My question would be, it is said in your slides that it's for 1 year. What happens after the first year? And then, did I understood correctly that they are already examining a transit? I mean, they can only come from a transit country, not from their country, nor from Canada already. And at the same time, it means that you have staff there that is already examining the asylum claims. So that would mean that through this private sponsorship program, you only welcome people that, of course, are already granted the refugee status, if I understood correctly, right? So there is no need then to examine the asylum request when once in Canada, right? Thanks a lot. And one last question, and thanks a lot to Ms. Kandura as well. So the commitments that you've taken by signing the agreement with our guest that will speak just in a few minutes are something additional. I mean, they're not counted within the resettlement commitment of the Italian government, right?
So I'll speak to your two questions. First of all, yes, not everyone has a job after a year, even those within privately sponsored refugee arrangements. At the end of the year, they would be entitled to social assistance, as would any Canadian or Canadian permanent resident, if that's the case. And that often happens. People are not always able to be fully independent after 1 year. We see a much better outcome with private sponsored refugees, but that's possible, and we do provide the same assistance we would any other permanent residents. It's probably a good time for me to also mention sponsorship breakdown. It happens. We do our best as a government to provide training, communication, support, but there are instances where someone arrives and that sponsorship group who has been sponsoring them is unable to take it. And in those cases, the government will step in. It's very rare, but it can happen. So just to share that with you. Assessment in Canada, no, we do have an asylum system in Canada. So if someone arrives recently from the US, we've seen, but mainly if someone comes undocumented in an airplane and they arrive, we have a completely separate system for what we would consider asylum seekers. For our resettlement program, so government-assisted refugees, privately sponsored, and our blended programs, all of those individuals are fully assessed as any permanent resident would be outside of Canada in the country to which they've fled. So outside of their country of origin, but before they arrive in Canada.
Sì, solo per precisare la domanda.
I just wanted to say, yes, I've understood that this will help us to increase these legal and safe channels that are what we want. But the question really is, I think I've understood that in the difference between the two models, you recognize that with the involvement of these organizations and the private sponsorship, it's actually easier to include people because of that relationship of trust that's established with these people. Are you thinking about continuing and strengthening this involvement of civil society in the reception and in the resettlement plans?
Okay, I will answer in English. First of all, if I can just give a very short remark on visa, on what you said. I'm not an expert on visa. Just I would like to underline that we use the existing legislation. So we use Article 25 of the Visa Code, which is a visa with limited territorial validity. Just this remark. With regard to your question, yes, our commitment with the humanitarian corridor is additional to the resettlement program. Integration is a challenge, both for the private sponsorship program, both for the resettlement program. And we are trying to develop new measures to enhance the integration of refugees. Of course, if a person is welcomed and hosted, for example, by a family in his own house, the integration in the society could be easier, could be faster. That's why I mentioned a different kind of relationship that the private sponsorship can have. But anyway, I also would like to underline that in the first phase of both programs, we focused more on the procedure and because different actors are involved. Now we are focusing more on the second phase, let's say, which is integration, which is a challenge, and we are trying to find also new solutions, and we'll see.
Thanks a lot. So, Joseph, I will welcome you to exchange our roles and to continue the discussion. Thanks a lot to all the discussants and for your attention during this first discussion. And I just I just welcome the new guests to come and sit down here. I hope you will be able also to tell us what kind of connection with other civil society organization, church organization in the other member states to maybe develop this model further on. Thanks.
Good afternoon. We have 45 minutes left, and we have interesting speakers, so I will try to be as brief as possible. And I mean, it is clear, I think, that there are advantages, and we already heard it from the Canadian example. So I will immediately ask the discussants to join in. I just wanted to share one experience from my country. I'm coming from Austria. We are receiving always a lot of refugees, not always on a very structured basis, but the most important part of our story, I would also say success story, is that there was private ownership of the process. So many people really took care of refugees. And one example, for instance, a village I'm leaving, we received 90 refugees from Afghanistan. People in the first stage were curious what's going on, were opposing it. So then the community took over the responsibilities. After half a year, the refugees came to other places, and the people in my village said, "Where are our refugees?" So they were actually taking ownership over the whole process. And I think this is a good example, because in the context of my country, the position of the government was to divide the refugee population to small units and to smaller villages. And so this was, and if we do it now in a more structured way, on a scheme, I believe that there is a lot of potential. A second example, 15 years ago, Bosnia war, something like 120,000 people came to our country. The ex-Yugoslav communities took over responsibilities because this was their people. And we integrated 80,000 of former Yugoslav population without any problem. So this is actually just telling a success story. And we are talking now about what we can do. So there are advantages, and I will start with Paolo Naso. He's the coordinator of the Mediterranean Hope Project promoted by FCEI. So we try to be 5 to 6 minutes. Yeah? Thank you.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Grazie per...
Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. My work is greatly helped by the fact that I'm talking after Ms. Kandura, who described the structure of the project very well. I'm going to be talking mainly about integration. Now, first of all, I'm going to describe the three sponsors. The community of Sant'Egidio is undoubtedly the most well-known sponsor because of its international activity. I'd like to note that the project from the outset has had a real ecumenical dimension because the other two partners in the community of Sant'Egidio were the Federation of Churches in Italy that includes a number of Protestant churches and the Waldensian Church, and that is the Presbyterian Church in English, so it's more of a Calvinistic church. And these three churches, three religious structures, have decided that the situation is extremely serious and that it wasn't enough just to look to reception policies. So now you can see here the deaths in a number of global contexts. As you can see, the Mediterranean area has some 4,600 deaths a year, and that is the most serious and most dangerous area in the world in which there is the greatest number of loss of life. Now, this dramatic information that has really struck people, mainly in Italy, is mainly due to the fact that the major routes from the south towards Europe operate in a different way today. Two of the traditional routes, that is from Morocco to Spain, and then from the east through Greece and Turkey over the Balkans, they have been closed off because of the international political agreements. The only route now partially open is the central route, and that explains why Italy, more than any other country, more than Spain, more than Greece, has been affected by exceptional migratory pressure over the last few years. Now, the origins of this crisis are well known. We have migration phenomena, economic phenomena combined with immigration because of persecution and religion. It's impossible, given the current status, to distinguish between economic migrants and asylum seekers, and that is why in our project we've thought about a different reasoning. Now, the legal basis is given by Article 25 of the Schengen Treaty, and key here is vulnerability. Somebody who is vulnerable because they're being chased, they're escaping from a war situation, they're victims of slavery, they've been harmed, and they need urgent help. Therefore, the concept of vulnerability is a broader, more flexible concept, and it's easier to manage compared to other kinds of interpretative category. And that's why the treaty has given us a legal instrument. It's quite rare because there are a few other legal instruments in migratory legislation that enable us to use this key. Hence, the MOUs that were mentioned by the previous speaker, then in accordance with very rigorous procedures, they guarantee two things. They guarantee safety, but also national safety as well, safety for the migrants and safety for nationals, and that's really much appreciated. The humanitarian corridor allows for checks on people, and few other instruments allow for that. From that point of view, it's a tool that really protects people. The model is being disseminated. It's being tested in France, and it's very positive. It's also been tried out in Belgium recently. Our hope, of course, is that other countries as well will join in. I'll skip forward to the conclusions now. I'd like to say that the humanitarian corridors intervene on the migratory chain. They don't intervene in the departure mechanism only, but they also intervene in reception. So that makes it possible to ensure shared integration. The first thing is that we avoid concentrations, and people participating in this project are placed in small nuclears in the north and the south of the country. But the second key of our policy is participation. That is, we create a network of people who are really involved in integration. I'd just like to give you an example. I think it's exceptional. And that's the example of a small town in Calabria, a town with strong mafia presence. It has often not had a municipal council because it's been dissolved by the mafia. Some areas were expropriated by mafia organizations, and some families benefiting from the humanitarian corridors were inserted in these villages under mafia control. And basically, they've been revitalizing a village that was dying. It was the mayor who welcomed the beneficiaries into the village. So we have an experience which is also allowing for integration on the part of the migrants. It's self-financed. It doesn't cost the state a single penny. And one final thing, it enables people to come with cases, with luggage. It doesn't only allow them safety and security, but it also gives them a bit of dignity. Thank you very much.
Very much, Cesare Zucconi. The floor is yours.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Since I'm speaking last, I can take advantage of all of the explanations given previously. Therefore, I might repeat a few things, but I'll also underscore some. First and foremost, this initiative is an initiative that comes from civil society, and I really need to emphasize that given the deaths at sea, but also given the fact that there is no sure legal access to Europe.
The back door is only open, and the back door is quite dangerous. Allora,
so, how do we open up a legal and safe way in and save lives? That was the reason for which we agreed with the Italian government, with which we're working really well, to open up this new road into Italy, if you like. Now, the initiative is based on civil society involvement, civil society which identifies people initially in Lebanon. We've talked about Syrian refugees above all, but they're selected based on vulnerability criteria without taking into account ethnic or religious factors when we're making that selection, and we enable them to come with a safe via a safe flight into Italy. I'd like to emphasize a number of other points. Mr. Nazzle spoke about it: security and safety. Safety for the people who are coming in. People don't have to travel by sea or risk dying at sea, and also safety for the state receiving these people, because these people have been identified. Their identity was checked by the police force. Their fingerprints have already been taken at the embassies in the third countries. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, I would say, that it's a form of innovative integration. That is, these people aren't received by professionals in the field of reception, but they are taken in by families, by Italian citizens, by people who are really willing and able to help. And we have seen, much to our surprise actually, a great response on the part of civil society, a great willingness to help these people out. And that has enabled us to mobilize a series of resources that are often not mobilized by the institutions and the authorities. And this is something that makes this project particularly important, I think, for the institutions. First and foremost, it saves them money because, as Paolo Naso said, the entire initiative of the humanitarian corridors is managed financially as well by the promoting associations. And then there's the whole aspect of reception and integration for a specific period of at least 1 year is taken charge of by the promoting associations. And then so many volunteers, so many citizens are mobilized, and that allows for a great deal of saving in terms of reception. It doesn't mean that the quality is worse. No, there's an average cost saving when it comes to reception and integration of the people coming to Italy, but that doesn't mean scrimping on quality. We've seen how, right from the outset, a very particular link is established with the community hosting these people. The fact that children are instantly sent off to school, adults are instantly taught Italian. There's a real community established around these people. And this network that is created can even provide people with job opportunities. So many resources are mobilized. And I would say something else that we've seen over the past year and a half. The first people arrived in February 2016. But another important aspect, which is that often the arrival of refugees, even in small towns and villages, has revitalized these towns and villages. It's really given them a boost, and Mr. Weidenholzer was saying that. And it's a really important factor that needs to be taken into account. Therefore, I would say that this project really does contribute to transforming the narrative on migrants who have been seen in general by our countries as a threat, as an attack on safety. Through the humanitarian corridors, and the fact that these corridors focus on the history and the backgrounds of these people. Think that about 40% of the people who have come through this project are under the age of 18, and that's really the reality for refugees throughout the world. Almost half of them are children. The fact that that their stories, their faces are really focused on through this project is contributing to changing the narrative and the idea that we have of these people. And you can even see how coexistence is possible, and it adds value. I think that the message is that immigration is being managed. And I think that this is an important message. It's being managed, and we're involving civil society. Now, I'd like to say one last thing. I think I've got a couple of minutes, have I? This project has also sought to be a model that can be replicated. It was established in Italy. We've heard about how it's growing and expanding in Italy. 1,000 people have already arrived. We've signed an agreement for another 1,000 people, mainly Syrians. We've opened the corridor to Ethiopia for Eritreans, Sudanese, and Somalian people. Therefore, progress is being made in Italy. As a previous speaker said, we're seeing success. But a few months ago, there was an agreement signed with France as well. The Protestant Church, the Catholic Church in France, and the community of Sant'Egidio, they signed another agreement for 500 people, Syrians again, to come to France, replicating the model. And then very recently, Belgium also signed a similar agreement. It is our hope that this model can be replicated in a number of European states. There are discussions underway with a number of other European countries. But this could be a model that might allow for the opening up of a legal and safe way and to ensure integration. Okay, there are difficulties with respect to these humanitarian corridors, but we could have integration. It's really involved civil society, and that's part of its success. Also, echoing what Paolo Naso said about distributing refugees throughout Italy. Now refugees are in some 18 regions and 80 cities, so 1,000 people in 80 cities in Italy. I'd better stop there, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Peter Niedermüller. He's member of the Libe Committee and also very much engaged in all these questions. He's coming from Hungary, a country which not really chose the
right way.
So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Ellie that you brought so much interesting and rich Italian experience into discussion, and of course Canadian, sorry for that. The European Parliament and the European Union and the Commission and the Council, we work all together on the common European asylum system. And in the frame of this work, we deal a lot with reception conditions and relocation and resettlement and many other very difficult and important issues. And my impression is that we talk not enough about what happened to the people after arriving and getting the right to stay here, what happened to them? And this is the issue of the social integration. And I think so it's very important just to make an important difference between social integration and cultural assimilation. As far as I understood, you have already discussed this topic in the first panel. And I was really happy to listen to you, Mr. Naso, when you mentioned that social integration means participation in social life and also in political life. And of course, it's absolutely crucial to say that what we would like to have in Europe, this is the inclusive society, but at the same time we accept, of course, the cultural diversity. So what we are trying, this is not a common, homogeneous European culture or identity or whatever. We accept, at least me, the different identities and the cultural diversity, and at the same time the participation in social and political life. This is the one point. The second point, and therefore it was very important, was both of you, but also the first panel offered us, the simple fact that integration happens always in communities. Without communities, there is no integration. The integration is not something floating in the air. And I think so, if we are talking about integration in communities and we put the question, what does it mean in the reality? It means always to be involved in social networks and to be involved in personal networks. If this is not the case, then we cannot talk about social integration. And I think so it's also a third point is very important, and this is the mutual recognition. That we accept the community and the community accept the migrants, the refugees, and the networks they try to build up. Of course, first of all, in the bigger European cities, in the bigger European metropolis is always an issue of the so-called ethnic neighborhoods and no-go areas and whatever. And I think so this is something which we have to discuss very frankly and very deeply. What does it mean to have ethnic neighborhoods, to have local neighborhoods with ethnic population? Because I think so it's sometimes very important to see what we have to learn, and this is what I mentioned already before, what we have to learn is how to live among different cultures, and how to live in cultural diversity. You in Canada have definitely a lot of experiences and maybe other experiences that we have here in Europe. But I think so we have to accept that the multicultural society is a reality. And what we have to do is, and what we have to discuss is, what does it mean, social integration in the multicultural societies, and how can we help the social integration in these societies? There's another problem, I think, which is very important for us in Europe, as far as I can see. Because we have seen, or we have to take into consideration that social integration is a longer process. It does not happen in 3 weeks. It does not happen sometimes in 3 years. And I'm just mentioning that fact because there's a lot of discussion in this House about the terrorism and about the connection between terrorism and migration and refugees and things like that. And I think it's very important to make it very clear that this kind of terrorism is product of the European societies. It has nothing to do with refugees. It has nothing to do generally with migration. And we have to put the question, what does it mean that there are many, or not so many, younger people, second, third generation young men and women who say no to integration, and they say the radical Islam is a real alternative for me to the Western liberal democracy. I think so. This is a question we have to put in, and we have to ask what's the reason for that. And of course, radicalization is something which works very, very strongly against social integration. And we have to put the question, what does it mean, de-radicalization? And maybe 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we have an anti-terrorist committee in this House, and we had a discussion, and somebody came from the Brussels police, and he told to us that de-radicalization is a legend, is a myth. And I had a discussion with him because this is what I think. If we say de-radicalization is just a legend, it never happens, then in that case I have to say we can close this door and we can go home. So I think so what we have to do is really to work on that social integration means at the same time is de-radicalization as well. So they're not, and we need some common efforts to work on that. And my very last sentence, very last minute, and of course there's a lot of responsibility on the side of the European societies. There's a lot of responsibility on the far-right parties and movements in Europe who are producing hate, who are producing xenophobia. And you just mentioned the country that I'm coming from, and this is the best example. How can you produce xenophobia? How can you produce hate? And therefore, I think so it's very, very important to say if we are fighting against far-right political movements, if we are fighting against xenophobia, then we are fighting at the same time for social integration and against radicalization. And I think so this is our political and moral duty as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have some time left for questions. Be ready to take 1, 2, 3. So, okay. One is in the back, then you and then Eli, yeah? Yes, please. If you want, would you introduce yourself? It would be interesting for us, of course, yeah?
It's Reza Jubali. I'm from OVO Association based in Germany. First of all, I would like to thank you for hosting the conference. I think Mr. Niedermuller, if I'm correct, pointed out a very important issue. Since I am a refugee and I was a member of a terrorist organization that it was in a terrorist list in 2014, Iranian Mujahideen, I think it's very important. The reason is a year ago, about 2,000 Mujahid from Iraq, they transferred them to Albania. And these 2,000 people are based in an old US military place in Albania. And I think this is what you said. This is very dangerous. I know that they are old. I was with the organization for 30 years. But this is a threat for future of Europe. And as we speak, Maryam Rajavi, the leader of this organization, is right there next door talking about freedom and democracy when they segregate these 1,800 people in Albania. And 2 days ago, they transferred them 20 kilometers out of Tirana to some old places with walls and fence and all that. So it's possible to de-radicalize, because I am de-radicalized, I live here, but they have to be individual. You cannot bring 2,000 people and put them in one place. And I think we have a lot of holes in European politics and the refugee situation, and this is very important. I think it's time for the European Parliament member to put a stop in this terrorist leader that comes here and talk about freedom and democracy. Thank you.
For sharing your experience. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And there's a common line among the three of you, and probably before our guests. The numbers that we seem to talk about are just units of 90, 80, or even 100. And we talk of backdoor, illegal backdoor or legal backdoor. The question is, when would everyone understand the difference between backdoor and a straight door, open door? We're talking of a country, in my country, Lebanon, accepting 2 million people straight away. There was no backdoor. And they are living there, surviving almost. We never enacted camps. We never put them in camps. The question is, when will we one day understand or eradicate the word backdoor and fences? That's the question. Thank you.
Collecting all the questions. So just indicate, please, again, who wants to take the floor. 1, 2, 3, yeah? Okay. So, Ellie, first.
Grazie, Joseph.
Thanks, Joseph. I'll take advantage to speak Italian. I'd like to thank you, all four of you, in fact, for what you've said. But once again, I'd like to sincerely thank Mrs. Zucconi and Naso for coming here, because it's really meaningful. For years, we've been insisting on the fact that the only way of stopping human traffickers is by providing legal, safe forms of coming to Europe. And unfortunately, we're coming up against strong resistance on the part of European governments, not all of them, of course, when it comes to opening up these safe legal ways for access. And until they're open in all member states of the European Union, I fear that the only way of exercising legitimate rights, which is to request international protection, is through policies supported by all of these organizations, criminal organizations that you've been talking about. And we've seen the tragic images coming from Libya and other countries. There's prisons, detention centers, tortures, constant violations of human rights. And as the CNN has been saying recently, it's a true return to slavery. Therefore, the only way forward to do what you have courageously started to do is to show an example to other European countries. They should look to what you're doing, and I can hear that I've seen that you're trying to carry out similar experiments in other countries. This isn't only a model to ensure a safe way of coming in without using traffickers, but as you have demonstrated, it really facilitates social integration. It creates links, ties, contacts, networks, trust. Therefore, I'd also like to say that I really agree with what Paolo said previously. In particular, in our country, it's clear that reception carried out in huge concentrations doesn't facilitate social integration. Also, from a point of view of safety, as you said, it doesn't help. Rather, this model that needs to be focused on an international, European and national level is that reception in small quantities in small towns and villages where people can be followed up on, they can be given services, there's transparency in terms of accountability, and also there's regular support, and that facilitates matters. And then people, particularly on the right, are talking about the business of immigrants, and I've been to an area with hundreds of people, and there have been hundreds of arrests related to mafia infiltration. You can really smell the mafia in certain places, and I think what you're trying to do is ensure that people are spread out throughout the country, that people are really focused upon ensuring that people have the necessary competence to host these migrants. So thank you very much for the example that you're giving to Europe, and we're doing our best to disseminate this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'll make it quick in French. Je suis
Mohamed is my name, a refugee living in Belgium now for a number of years. You talked about prevention and you talked about radicalization of refugees. We must try to work against that and to ensure that Europe isn't infiltrated by elements that are going to fan the flames of radicalization amongst groups of refugees and citizens. An Iranian movement was mentioned in Albania, and a source of extremism and terrorism, but that movement is supported by the Iranian regime, promoting religious extremism in the region, not only in Iran, but in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and further afield. I just wish to bring that to your attention, saying that there are elements of the regime, and it's fairly scandalous for Europe to be witness to this type of situation.
When they are in many such problems. And we know that the international community now, they say about Iran is the biggest country, the terrorists in the world. The big problem they make in the area in Middle East against humanity, against all the problem. Most of refugees from Syria, from everywhere that come, you see that the big hand of Iran, they collaborated to make organize about such aim that only war and the people. And I want to say that such wrong people, as me, that here coming, escape to in Europe, they are protected. Who was coming to protect the Iranian government, terrorist government? And they say, yes, the big opposition, democratic opposition, that known by international community, and they are coming to show how is the abuse the human right in that area. That is really, really shame. Yes. Yeah, that is really shame for that such people that come here to such protect the Iranian government, fundamentalism, and terrorists in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to start?
Yeah. I think going to the main goal of our meeting, and I salute very. I'm happy about this opportunity to speak about that, because I am convinced that we have to mainstream in some way into the European legislation the sponsorship modality. How this is up to you and up to the different countries, but I think that we have the Canadian example, but in Europe, this project of humanitarian corridors shows that it works, that it is possible, and maybe each country could, on annual basis, determine the number of visa to be extended for this very modality, and so that we can scale up the numbers and the work of these sponsorship programs. We were saying before that in the Italian legislation there was already the sponsorship, but it was frozen. Cancelled, yes. So there is the possibility to do that, but this should be implemented by the European countries. This is really a legal and safe and possible way which already showed some success. So this is just what I wanted to say. Thanking for the questions and for the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Niedermüller for his great vision he offered about the issue of integration. The focus of our panel was sponsorship, but now it's very clear that there is no integration without sponsorship, and we will have a very weak and partial sponsorship if we don't include policies of integration in that. And your idea about integration is exactly what we try to perceive with our program. If I may, if Dr. Kandura will allow me, I want to mention that just a few weeks ago, the Minister of Interior issued a national plan for integration. And it's a comprehensive strategy outlining exactly this strategy. And what is interesting is that the communities of faith play a very important role, both in welcoming the migrants as well as being vocal for the migrants. And what the Italian government is doing with the Islamic leadership to grant a moderate voice in the public debate is part of this strategy. So thank you for this vision. The last word is to thank Eli Schlein for this unique opportunity to share what we are doing. Thank you also for what we are doing for the Dublin issue that is very sensitive, of course, in an Italian perspective. About the strategy, we mentioned France, we mentioned Belgium. We have a strong expectation that Switzerland, that is part of Schengen, will enter in this idea of the humanitarian corridors. We have been working a lot in Germany also. I assume that some Germans are here. And I can ensure that the churches, exactly the same churches that started the program in Italy and in France, are ready to start in Germany too, because there is a full covenant and agreement. So what is missing up to now is the political determination, the political voice. But we are confident that the debate could soon bring to something more practical. Why I say this? Because, yes, to do something good is nice. To start a good practice is nice. And it's very helpful also for the few people that we succeeded to benefit with our programs. But this is not an European policy. This is just a good practice, and what we need in a more comprehensive strategy is an European policy, and this policy that we are still hoping, and thank you for creating this space to discuss about the future of this policy.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for their contributions. I think this was really a very important discussion, and it shows that there are many effects. So it's an effect on the arrival already fighting organized crime. It is an effect of inclusive society, mending broken societies in villages. We saw in the mafia case, for instance. And it's also about activating civil society, which is also very important for us in a time where individualism is just destroying societies. So it is, I believe, very important that we go this way. I want to thank especially our Italian friends for receiving so many people from migrants from Africa. So you're really doing a very, very important job, and nobody is really appreciating this. So I want to thank you formally for this. And I also think it is a good sign that you also, above all your difficulties you have, you also mobilizing your fantasy in creating new models. And I think this corridore umanitario is a very good example, and it may find its way in our language, and we may in future using the Italian word for it. So thank you very much for this. Thank you, Elio, of course. And we, as the Socialist and Democratic group in this parliament, we took up these ideas. We drafted an amendment which will be voted, and it exactly means what we were discussing. And it was Eli taking it up. And just to conclude my remarks, it was a visit of Libe Committee to Canada, where we saw that this is working, and then we tried to also to look for the Canadian roots of the whole thing, and so it is a Canadian, Italian, European project, and I hope we can succeed in the votes and make it as an example for future approach how we can deal with the problem. So thank you very much. And now we were just checking, you are invited for some drinks there outside and not inside the room. I was a bit scared there would be no drinks, so drinks are outside. Thank you very much. So it's in, yeah, can you, because just 1 second, where is it? Yes. So I was a little